Hello and welcome to my Regalia deck profile for the premium format. I use this to get first place in Bushiroad Spring Fest 2022 London. I've made this list different to the other three first place decks that I used because there are some kind of weaknesses to having three first places, in that in a way it's sort of like setting up a local meta, because it means then people start to expect your deck more rather than focusing entirely on whatever happens to be meta. Well, in this case, I guess my teammates did play Nightmare Dolls and May Colony, but obviously Regalia kind of gets dragged in as well a bit as a deck that people would prepare for because of that. And obviously if you have a consistent list where a lot of cards that I use are very similar, then people might start to play around you the full time around if you're still using the same list. So I've made the changes just to kind of get around that weakness that I have inherently, which is a pretty unique weakness to have in a Spring Fest, but I try to use that to my advantage. So I'll explain those kind of card choices that I've done. I'm going to actually only focus on the changes that I made because I've done similar deck profiles before, but I'd also advise that even though V-Clan Collection and P-Clan Collection in particular, which just came out, even though they're going to be affecting Regalia and maybe people might start trying out some things from those sets, I would still watch this profile because there are some card choices that you may want to consider anyway in the future if you want to test with things and so on. And even if you're not a Regalia player, you may be able to adopt some of these ideas as well. So obviously we play the starter, we play 4 Angelicas, 4 CEOs, 3 Gleipnir, because you need to fish a lot of your ride cards actually, because you've got PGs, you've got Stride Fodders that can search for grade 3s, you have VAR which can soul charge, and obviously you've got anti-deck out cards, and you've got CEO Drasil, which is a key card, so you can actually have your restand plays. 4 copies of Norn. You want to avoid running this card even though it has a Vanguard skill, because the rearguard skill to restand is just too good, and it's what makes a big difference actually. 4 copies of Thrid, so I'm playing this because it has 10k base, and it has Regalia's name. I wanted to just make the Minerva play easier to access, because obviously if you just have one Norn, then you easily get your 3 Regalia's soul off of that. You don't have to rely as much on soul charges, and I did cut my other soul charges in this deck, so there is a bit less ways of doing things. And this card does have a lot of other applications too, and in that it can draw you cards obviously in the early game, but we'll get a bit into that as we go in further. Then we have 1 copy of Ratcham, so I've cut it from 4 to 1 because I don't really want to be punished because people were playing around Ratcham and then I'm just sitting here with dead cards in my hand. Also, the card is very resource heavy, which is why a lot of people don't play in the first place. Instead, I kind of gave up on Nightmare Dolls because if they just draw multiple Leslies and Alices, I'm just wasting my time really. So I just focus on aggression and just trying to close the game as much as I can. I just want to get things done over with against those decks, but honestly, it's kind of difficult. I'm not really sure about whether or not to play this card in general. And in the entire tournament, I've only used it once against Prisms. Well, obviously, well, sorry, not Prisms, against Highlander, which is the Pearl Sisters I use it on. But obviously it's a one-off, so there's less chance to use it. But I don't end up actually needing it anyway throughout the entire tournament that I played this card. And it's okay otherwise, if you want to counter some annoying decks, but if you can play without it, maybe play without it. It's sort of a meta call in some cases. Obviously, if we ever get to a format where we need this again, then maybe play more of it again. But I wanted to just kind of make use of the fact that people are anticipating me playing this card, so I wanted to trip people over who were playing around it a lot and use that to my advantage. And if I played 1 copy, then it just means that if they don't see it during the game, and say they assume that I don't play Ratcham, then obviously at least I still have 1 on my deck, which I could use if people start to get their guard down a bit. But then alternatively, if someone sees it in my deck, then they could assume that I'm still playing more copies. And Genesis does soul charge a lot as well, so it does kind of reveal a lot of information as a clan, and that can be a disadvantage. So you still have to play at least some kind of copy of it. I don't think I had enough space to really play 2. I kind of wanted to play Thrid at 4 because Thrid can pass gauges as well for free, which will be important and something that I'm going to explain soon. There's 3 copies of Flap Angel. And then there's 4 copies of VAR, 4 of the Perfect Guards, 1 Ordained Owl. This prevents deck out. It gives your grade 3 5k power. It's not once per turn, so you can do this infinitely if you have grade 3s available. And I've made some big columns with this that have won me games during the day as well. So this is a really strong card as well, really useful. And it just lets you have a full-on Minerva turn again. You can do like 3 attacks that are over 60k quite often with this card. And another thing as well is that VAR, the grade 1 that counter charges and soul charges, if you use it for the counter charge ability, you can basically put the grade 3, if you put a Regalia grade 3 in as your gauge, and you can basically send it to your drop zone. That way, you've got another way of putting grade 3s away, and then you have Minerva's Soul Blast 3 skill to gain +1 drive and 10k power. You can use that skill to also send grade 3s, so you can actually get 4 grade 3s into your drop zone if you find 4 Regalia grade 3s through that method, which is pretty handy actually. So that's just a little trick to buff up All In Now more easily as well, or in cases when you can't actually use the first skill and you just have to cut straight to the GB3 because you don't have enough soul. So All In Now is a very strong card. And then Expert Angel, this also helps with preventing deck out, but only by 2 cards because it's once per turn, and it gains 3k power. But the nice thing about it is that you can place that and just draw when you have first stride, so you can use Minerva stride and then Soul Blast 3 and then just use the drop zone to draw your card with it. You can also return Norn to your deck, which is really important because sometimes you soul charge your Norns and then it just ruins your ability to actually play, I guess. So she's nice for this too. I was actually playing this at 2 until last minute when I decided to add 1 for Atrimin. So I don't know if it makes as much sense playing just 1, maybe try and put 2 copies. Then there's 1 over trigger because I don't really want to take a risk with a Keta Sanctuary over trigger in case I deck myself out. Even though Minerva's GB3 does take away all your units' drive checks, I'm not willing to take that risk in case I don't use Minerva. Then there's 4 Regalia crits because it has a Regalia name, and also it draws a card, which is really helpful because drawing is what helps you find CEOs when things are going south. You always have to plan around the idea of cards that you might draw into that can lead into your CEOs, even things like drawing into your stride fodders, keeping your grade 3s in hand so you can use your stride fodder skill to reveal the grade 3. There's all these kind of small things you kind of have to think about. 4 stride assist crits as well, obviously to stride with and have good defense. And then Tablet Angels, 2 copies, 1 copy of Dreaming Dragon because Dreaming Dragon can recycle your deck, but to be honest I didn't really want to play this originally. I was actually going to do 11 crits and then last moment I changed to 1 Dreaming Dragon just in case because I was starting to get very worried, and obviously cutting Expert Angel down to 1 copy was another reason to run this card. Another thing as well is that All In Now, even though it prevents deck out, you're not putting triggers back in, but it's sort of like a pseudo trigger because you are giving 5ks, and if you do reroute grade 3s you are giving Force Marker as well, so you can sort of have double crit big power without using triggers. Then we have 4 copies of the heal trigger, and then off to the G zone, the obvious 4 of Minerva because this is what wins you games. Then there is Amaruda, which obviously is an alternative way of giving power and drawing cards as well. If you struggle to get CO Yggdrasil, this is a good card to go into. Then there's Marduk because it lets you high roll against your opponent and do some crit pressure, potentially stealing games at times, but it's really useful against decks like Nightmare Dolls as well. Gives you more of a chance. Then there's 2 copies of Earth. Earth is a good card to fall back on if you run out of resources because she can actually do something during that turn. And also you can sort of steal games with it as well if your opponent isn't playing a deck that finds PGs as easy, or you just notice your opponent's been guarding with them early, damage checking them, soul charging them, sending them to drop zone via Grand Blue or whatever. So Earth is kind of good for that kind of situation. And 1 copy of Muse Spell because it can counter charge as well. It's easier to manage this skill. It's there just in case you can't do stuff too. Now the important bit, I took out 1 Tagut, which is the G guard that soul charges same names as a unit on your field and gains 10k shield for the Sea Breeze. So Sea Breeze is basically a Camelot 2 and you can stride it if your opponent didn't ride in the preceding turn. And that's really helpful because Marduk, the issue I have with Marduk right now, because you don't really expect Genesis players to really use Sea Breeze these days when you've got Marduk around. The issue I have is that when you use Marduk, you get the Generation Break 1, but then you lose 6 soul. And although you can usually get your soul back to then use Minerva's GB3, if you're going against a deck like Mega Colony, it's harder because they stride Gridora. So Mega Colony's grade 2 game is quite good because they have the Giraffe grade 2, and they can sort of go on for a while hitting you with bigger numbers. And obviously to counterplay it, you need to have 2 stand units. Unless they call the beat that rests your units, then they can still draw cards. But they do put a bit of pressure on your cards, and Regalia's Greed 2 game is a bit weak. It's very average, and it's not really the most reliable either. So I would say Seabreeze was helpful because at least if my opponent Grade Stores and they're not rerunning Grade 2, which is a -1 from hand every time, which they're less likely to do as well because it's not a common play either, then I can bring out this Seabreeze without having to drag the game for too long, because I don't really want the game to drag on, since if it does, then it means that Meg Collins recovering and finding better defense cards, finding the book, etc. So Seabreeze was needed for that. So I just go into this, get my Generation Break 1, and then I can prepare for GB3, because if you go against Ghidorah, you're riding up first, you're striding, get your GB1, they go to Ghidorah, that means you can't G-Guard, so you can't use the G-Guards to Soul Charge and set up for Minerva's Soul Blast cost, but then you can't get Generation Break 3 either for your next turn. So Ghidorah kind of cripples you in 2 different ways there as well, while Marduk, while he's helping you get the Generation Break 1, he's also taking away your soul, so he's getting you close to Minerva, but also taking you further at the same time, which is kind of tricky. So trying to draw into like a bunch of soul charges is pretty tricky, and it puts a lot of pressure, so that's why I needed Seabreeze in here, just for this reason. And obviously the reason why it's so important to get GB3 for Minerva is because Meg Conley, or Ghidorah again, Ghidorah rests your entire field, keeps it in rest, so you can't stand your field, that is. So after you've done your turn 3 of attacking, they basically just keep all units in rest in your next turn, and then you go into your next turn unable to basically swing or restand your units and things because they paralyze maybe your Norn from turn 3 and so on. So, oh, and also Seer Yggdrasil can't Spherical either because Ghidorah shuts that off as well. So Ghidorah really does hurt this deck in a lot of ways. And to restand, you need Generation Break 3 to stand up all your units. Obviously to do that, you need to first do the first skill, which is Soul Blast 3 to G flip. And that is how you get to your GB3. But you need to Soul Blast 3 Regalia as well, which is also extra effort because your V triggers are non-Regalia as well as some other units in the main deck. And then you have to follow up with 6 other Regalia units to Soul Blast on attack. So it's just so much strain on the deck, and Seabreeze lightens that, but obviously it's an extra counterblast, and that's something to be careful with. Thrud, the Grade 2 Regalia that has 10k base and gives your unit an equip gauge when it moves to Soul and Draw. That card is helpful because you could basically give Norn or something a gauge if you're lacking, because obviously you're not using Angelica if you're going into Seabreeze, because Angelica is being strode over during the main phase, which means you can't use the on attack before you do Marduk, so you do miss out on that. But that being said, the Norn behind the Vanguard gaining engage wouldn't have made a difference anyway because you couldn't boost in the first place. But then it could also help with your Ray Guards too, so there's always that. So another thing is that Seabreeze can gain 10k power off of Norn, so that's a bit different to Marduk. So we're offsetting the Counterblast issue. In case we don't get a Val, we do have Thrud, but you have to just make sure you have enough Counterblast. You have to be careful about how you use a Counterblast to make it work, but then once you get it to work, then you've got what you need and you should be doing better against Meg Conley, is the theory anyway, because this was a last minute sort of decision. So there's that. And otherwise, we just go through the rest. Iris, Dismal, 2 Loria, and 2 Ears, and that's pretty much it for my Regalia deck profile. So I hope you found that all useful, and let me know what you think down below, and I will bring out some more deck profiles for some of the V Premium stuff as well that we used during the weekend as well. So until then, I will see you later. Goodbye.